Okay, so what I'm going to do today is just talk a bit about how I became an artist and what was the process like for me. And I'll start with high school. So at high school, I was good at sciences. And so it seemed a logical thing to go to university and do science. So when I was 18, I moved to Canada and did a general first year science program. And it was a strange period in my life. I had very sort of black and white sort of views of things. I wanted yes or no answers to things. And so I did science there for a year. I did okay in it. But one of the things that bugged me was there was sort of multiple ways of solving problems, and I wanted a yes or no answer. For instance, you could solve a mathematical problem with matrices and algebra, and I just didn't like the idea that there were two ways of solving a problem. I wanted there to be, which was the best? Was it matrices or algebra? I wanted a black and white answer, and I had a very sort of Nazi mindset. There was no gray for me at that point in my life. And so another thing that I noticed the more I studied science was the more I realized that it was quite creative, especially mathematics. And people were sort of creating things in mathematics, like Newton created calculus. And I thought, that's really interesting. I like the idea that it was creative, but I never thought I could be creative in a way, these great people were like Newton or whatever. And so I sort of started looking at science slightly differently. I started looking at it in terms of, okay, it's not just black and white. There's actually, things that can happen in science that are quite interesting. And I finished my year, and I was heading back to. I got accepted I was heading back to Newcastle in the northeast of England to do a degree in science, in psychology. And during the summer, in between going back to England and having finished at Queen's, my first year, I fatally did a fine art course. And what that did was, it was run by a guy called Peter Johnson at Queen's University. And what that did was, it really opened up my eyes to a lot of different ways of thinking. And I actually really enjoyed it. And by the time that course was over, I knew that I didn't want to do carry on with science. So I'm in this bit of a predicament. I'm going back to university to do science in England, but I don't want to do it. So anyway, I go back to England and I go to the university and to the psychology department to tell them that I want to leave. And it was one of the weirdest sort of meetings I've ever had, because I go into this room with the head of department and I sit in a seat in the room, and he has all these antique guns on the table, like, from, I don't know, the 17th or 18th century. And I'm sitting in this seat and I notice all these guns are pointing at me. And I feel kind of, this is really weird and awkward. So I sort of lean over and, try and make conversation about the guns. And he says, please do not touch the guns. Their mechanisms are fully operational. And I just thought that was some weird sort of power trip. I didn't really know what to think of that. And I said, well, I want to see if I can try and transfer into fine art here. And he said, well, that's most unusual. No one's ever done that before. And, good luck to you, I think he was kind of annoyed, and probably rightfully so. So my next thing was, I had a portfolio from the work I'd been doing in the summer in Canada from the course. And so I went to the fine art department and pleaded with them to see my work. and their attitude was, well, you know, the course is full. I'm really sorry. Maybe you should try next year. Maybe, you know, you should, you know, have another think about it. And eventually they said, oh, okay, we'll have a look. So I arrived in the fine art department with the portfolio I had, and they took it into the staff room and then called me in a few minutes later, and all my work was spread out across this big table with all the profs sort of asking me these weird questions about my work and, you know, what I thought I was doing in art and what I thought art was about. And I mean, I didn't think the interview went very well at all. So they said, well, you know, come back in an hour and we'll have a talk again. So an hour later, I came back, and it was just the head of department, Norman Adams, who was the head of the Royal Academy, and he said to me, well, I guess we can offer you a place. So that was a real relief to me, because at that stage in my life, I was really struggling with myself, you know, just emotionally. I was in a quite unstable phase of my life. I, you know, had a lot going on in all sorts of areas. And so it was very important to get in. So one of the things about Newcastle, it's kind of modeled on the Bauhaus, which is a sort of German school that Ian probably knows about, which was the idea that you basically taught people skills they needed for learning, and they learned all these skills, and then they applied those skills to their artistic practice. So it was a very sort of unusual model for teaching, but I actually quite enjoyed the structure it gave. It sort of had a nice sort of structure to it that wasn't too much like, oh, well, you know, just find out who you are. One of the other things was, because I was going through a tough time, what I really found important for me at that stage was just turning up every day. And every day you would turn up at the university and you would sign in, and you're meant to sign in before 9 o'clock every day. And because I was having such a hard time in my life, signing in became really, really important, because I thought that, you know, I needed a structure. And if I didn't sign in, I would kind of lose myself and, you know, end up living on the street or something like that. And so it was, you know, just to begin with, the first few years, it was just a dogged sort of turning up on time and just trying to work. And one of the things that was really good about it was that there were so many different students there. It was at a time where, you know, you didn't have to pay for university, you just were there on merit. And so it meant that there was lots of different people, different students in my year from very different backgrounds. I mean, there were people whose fathers were boilermakers in the shipyards in Newcastle or in Sunderland. There was the heiress to Mercedes-Benz cars. So it was a really wide array of people. And they all came from different backgrounds and had very different ways of working, sort of very different mindsets with their work. And I found that kind of fascinating. I mean, to me, they seemed to be like complete artists. And I felt that I just knew nothing about art. And so I feel I learned a lot from the other students. And that was very important. Another thing was that I should just show you. Whoops. So these are some of the paintings. Can you see the screen okay? Can everyone?
Yes, it's
Okay.
fine.
So these are some of the paintings I did while I was there. Um, so another thing about me was that my father taught art. My stepfather was an artist. They were all, so I came from an artistic background in a lot of ways. So I arrived at university in some ways thinking I knew a little bit about art, but I found what I'd grown up with wasn't really who I was. And so in a sense, I had to go through this sort of process of sort of deconstructing myself and finding out who I actually was as an artist, and not just sort of rely on the things that I'd sort of almost been spoon-fed in a sense. So it was a sort of breaking down and sort of rebuilding structure of what I thought I knew. And the good thing about Newcastle is, or was, that I think after the second or maybe the third year, it gave you you got your own studio. So you had your own time and space to use your studio. You had a key to get in after dark. So you could set up your studio as a little sort of home. You know, you could have like little things there to make cups of tea and things. And I mean, some students took that to extremes. I mean, there was one guy after, I think after the second or third year, and he was caught camping under the stage in the lecture theatre with, you know, beds and TVs and everything. And so he was eventually found by the security people and told that he wasn't allowed to, you know, live under the lecture theatre stage. But I guess he saved a lot in rent, so good for him. I'm just going to go on for a few more images here. So these are the sort of things I was doing at Newcastle, and they're fairly sort of non-representational, sort of abstractly sort of things. And that's the sort of, you know, hints at the landscape in that one, I guess, with sort of like these gestural marks in the figure and stuff like that. Just sort of kind of have a dreamy quality to them. You know, they were strange paintings. They were very sort of evolving, and the marks sort of suggested things. So after I'd done my undergrad, which was 4 years, I went on to do my master's, which was another 2 years. And then while you were doing your master's, while you were in the university setting, everyone was really involved with art, and people were interested in ideas, interested in the way you were working. There were sort of, you know, unique, minute ideas about things that, you know, people thought were important. And when I left, it was totally the opposite. It was like no one was interested in what you were doing. No one was interested in art. I remember, you know, telling people I was an artist, and at a bar in London, and this guy said to me, "You're welcome." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're going to be on welfare for the rest of your life, and I'm going to be supporting you." And so this is the sort of attitude you have to deal with. And I mean, the welfare part, he was right. So after I finished doing my master's, I went on welfare for a year because I couldn't make a go of it. But I tried, and when I had some sort of heroic failures, I guess, in some ways. One of the things that happened was I was really desperate just to get out there, because I knew that after the first year, 95% of people with a fine arts degree are doing something different, and I didn't want that to happen to me. So I was desperate, and so the first thing I tried was, I heard that there was a shoe shop that was going to be showing art, or was thinking of showing art, and had shown a few artists. And so I thought, well, I should go to this shoe shop and see if they would be interested in showing any of my art. And I think they just looked at me like I was an alien and said, no. So my first attempt at having a show was being rejected from a shoe shop, but I didn't give up. And so I heard that someone told me that there was a gallery in the Greenwich Museum in London that was interested in my work, and I contacted the woman who was putting on the shows there, and I sort of bought my portfolio. I got on buses, trains, underground, walked with this heavy portfolio, and it was a real struggle just to get there because I was living in Oxford and it was Greenwich. I don't know if you know, but it's quite hard to get to. You have to go on various types of transport. But so I arrived there, and the front desk, there was a woman, and I said, "Oh, I've come to see so and so," and it's this great big marble hall. It's massive. And from the distance, I could hear these footsteps on the marble floor getting closer and closer and closer. And eventually this woman came around the corner and walked down this hallway towards me. And I opened up my portfolio. She looked at it for 30 seconds and said, "No." And she wasn't interested in looking at it any further. And I just sort of thought, oh, this is just awful. I've spent all this money, which I didn't have getting here. I've traveled all this distance, and I get 30 seconds to be told she's not interested in showing my work or even looking at all of it. So, so it was just a really awkward and disillusioning time for trying to be an artist in England. But one of the things I've been doing while I was at Newcastle is I've been coming to Canada to do art shows at Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto. And I've been selling quite a lot of art there. And so I knew that I could sell my art in Canada. And also a gallery there, which was around at the time, called Nancy Pools, said, if you ever emigrate to Canada, we're quite happy to take your work. So I thought, well, that's better than it is here. So I decided to emigrate. And so I moved back down to Cornwall because I'd run out of money, and I was sort of living with my parents and with my mother. And she said, well, you're not staying here unless you're working. So I got a job on a large estate, deadheading hydrangeas. So I was cutting off the heads of hydrangeas for about a year in this massive estate. And it was kind of an interesting time because I was out in the wilds, working in nature, but getting dirty, coming home, and it gave me a lot of time to think. So after I got all my papers together for emigration, I moved to Canada. And really, one of the things that happened to Canada was I had some very, very lucky breaks to begin with. One of the things was that I'd been doing the outdoor show, and there was a screenplay writer called Malcolm Mercuri who was working on movies in Hollywood, and he really liked my art, and I think him and his wife had a few pieces. And he said to me, you know, oh, can I take some of your images? You know, I'm going to take them over and just show them around in Hollywood. And I thought, oh, okay, well, fair enough. So one day I was in I was living with a group of people in a rented house. And one day I got this phone call, and this woman said to me, hi, Simon, Mel would like to talk to you. And I was like, well, Mel who? And she said, Mel Gibson. And I was like, oh, come on, someone's winding me up here. You know, what's going on, you know? And I said, oh yeah, would you know? Okay, right, yeah. And she kept on talking, and eventually I realized that, you know, she joined the dots a bit, and I realized that it was Mel Gibson, and again, she was serious. and she explained that he was doing a movie in which he played an artist, and they were looking. He'd seen my work and liked it and wanted to meet me. So I was flown down to Maine where they were filming, and I was driven by the production designer to his hotel room. And I walk into this room, and there's this guy sitting on the end of the bed who was rather short. And, I said, oh, I guess I'll wait here for Mel. And then she sort of said, hi, Simon, this is Mel. And it was a guy on the bed. I just didn't recognize him. And I was like, oh, hi. I'm Simon Andrew. And he said, oh, hi, Simon. And we chatted about what his ideas for the movie were and what he wanted me to do in terms of art. And one of the things is his character was this sort of disfigured artist who'd had a horrible accident, and one side of his face had burnt, and that's the image on the screen now. And so I had to sort of work out, this is Mel Gibson in his makeup from the set, and it's kind of based on that. So I was meant to make it look kind of disfigured and tormented. So this is what I came up with. And he talked to me about, what they wanted done and stuff. And then so I ended up working on the set, doing pictures of the landscape around Maine and supplying images for the movie for, I don't know, about 3 or 4 weeks. So my first sort of actual job interview, so I went from the sort of interview in Greenwich to the interview with Mel Gibson within about a year, just over a year. So that was very sort of extreme. It was sort of like no one interested in your work, to suddenly a lot more people interested in your work. And another big break I had early on was Rob Baker from the Tragically Hip. They were doing a new CD, and he came up to me and said, would you be interested in doing some art for our new CD? So I said, obviously, yes. And so suddenly I had, I had murals, I had my work on CD covers, album covers. There I am in this picture here, standing with the original drawing I did. And so I feel I got on the map really quickly in Canada, and I feel very, very lucky about it. And that kind of, in a way, made it a lot easier for me to begin my art career. So one of the things I'm going to talk about next is how have my ideas changed over the years being an artist. And one of the things is I've been doing art for a long time now. And when I was a student, one of the things that I found was you were surrounded by other students who had ideas, and you picked up ideas that were interested you from them and from what students were doing in other art schools. And you sort of had you were influenced by people, and you almost had a sort of certain group in which you sort of felt you were carrying with other artists, if that makes sense. You were sort of had certain ways of thinking. There's a certain way of working, and it gave you a confidence because you felt you belonged to something, and there were other people like you. And we had our sort of senior artists we liked, we have our sort of senior artist figureheads. Like I was very influenced by Howard Hodgkins at the time, or Arbach, or so you kind of gravitated towards these senior artists that you sort of felt you were almost part of their mantle or under their mantle. And you sort of, it gave you a certain sort of sense of belonging, but also a sort of a kind of respect, because the public could identify with who you were, what type of artist you were, and sort of like this was cool, this was what was happening. So it was an important stage, but in retrospect, I think it was quite derivative of a lot of art, but it gave you a sense of being a part of a cause or a movement almost. So I was part of this group of artists sort of interested in these same ideas, working in the same sort of way for a while. And I kind of thought that would go on forever. But after a while, I just I just sort of wanted to do something different, and I wanted to work in a different way and just sort of explore all the possibilities of art. I just didn't want to get stuck in a way of working as an artist. So one of the things I did was I'd always painted landscapes in England, but so I had a sort of emotional sort of connection to the landscape in England. And it's very hard to describe, but if you have a familiarity and emotional connection with the landscape, it's kind of almost hardwired at birth. You sort of always feel that this is your landscape and this is your environment and where you're from. And the sort of familiarity enables you to work in a way with the landscape that makes you sort of feel like it's not alien and it's part of you in some way. In some very sort of fundamental way. And I think when I arrived in Canada, I really didn't have that same sort of connection to the landscape. I felt the landscape was kind of alien in a way, and I didn't really know how to emotionally connect to it. And I felt that I had to find a way of using the landscape in a way that made some sort of sense. And so what I did was I saw it more as a tool to work with, paint on, more than a sort of place. It wasn't a specific place. It was much more a tool to sort of hang the paint on, to apply the paint to, and to make the paint part of. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was like it was about the paint more than the landscape in a way. And a lot of the time, I mean, I was looking in different ways. So a lot of these paintings are done from sort of memories of driving along and seeing Canadian landscape. So it's almost like it's filtered in the certain ideas of the landscape. And from memory, I'm working much more from memory. And so for me, this is, very much a Canadian landscape. It doesn't have very much of a English landscape feel for me. It has much more of the snow on the ground. Excuse me. So, and here's another one. I don't know if you can see that on your screen. And again, here, it's very much sort of, again, so there's sort of certain randomness to where the marks are and the way things are positioned. There's a lot of sort of abstract elements in this. It's sort of, again, to me, this is very much a Canadian landscape. Kind of, memories of various places I've been. I've driven across Canada once or twice, so you build up a vast visual memory bank of snippets of landscape. I've always tried to work in a lot of different ways. And so, concurrently with a lot of this sort of painting, I did you know, I did sort of, this is like a fairly straight sort of portrait of my partner, Erica. So I've always been sort of exploring ideas and sometimes working simultaneously in very diverse ways. And I think when you start to sell your work, there's a lot of pressure to make work in a certain way because you're making your living from it. And you always have to sort of be a little wary of that. It's often pressure you put on yourself. And you have to be a little bit careful about it. So when I was at university, one of the things I found was that part of my course, there was a lot of pressure to not paint technically. In fact, it was almost frowned upon. And so I felt that I had never really sort of learned to paint technically. And I wanted to sort of find out how bad I was at painting technically. So I embarked on a series of interiors. There was something sort of comforting about doing them because the process was a start. You could start them, then they would progress on to, they would go in a sort of linear way. There would be a start to finish process with them. And I kind of enjoyed doing these because they were very sort of methodical and they were from observation. And eventually I became interested in them more because they started pointing me back to abstract ideas again. And the shapes and the forms and the way they were positioned, I began to look at as abstract elements. So from there, I went on to doing some paintings like these, which seemed very, very different. But again, to me, this has a sort of interior feel with elements that are almost like objects in a room. There's bits and pieces there that as elements, they have their own identity in a way, these marks here, in the same way as objects do inside one of the interiors. And these became very interesting because there was a sort of randomness to them that I found kind of interesting in that they seem to have a sort of own reality to themselves. I then started sort of looking at the randomness in them and trying to sort of create this sort of randomness in landscape painting. So basically making a mark here and there and using that to create landscape. So I'm just sort of using that randomness and trying to hang it on a landscape painting. So these ones here are very much about the marks, abstract marks, superimposed on landscapes. So these are very much about the abstract elements. So if you zoom in on small parts of these paintings, you can see them as being abstract marks, but they kind of hang together as a landscape as well. So I'm just going to go through these ones. And again, they kind of are abstract, but they're kind of landscape, I guess. So, oh, I can hear a beeping. Is that someone? Is that an alarm? I don't know. Anyway, I can hear an alarm going off. So anyway, one of the things. So the progression was that I went from painting very sort of representational interiors, which led me to working in an abstract way, and the abstract elements led me back to landscape painting again. So one of the things that happens is when you're an artist, and you know you've been doing it for quite a while, you become you have a vast sort of visual library of information, and it becomes harder and harder to find art that's original without having some sort of mental reference from where it's evolved. So you can look at a painting and say, okay, I can see that's being influenced by that, and a little bit like that, and a little like that. And so I kind of wanted to try and get away from that. So I went through a process with these paintings, excuse me, of trying to make them problematic on purpose. So for instance, I would have naturally say put a mark in one part of this painting, and I said, okay, I'm not going to put it in the obvious place, I'm going to put it here instead. And I said, no, that might be obvious as well, so let's just put it there right in the middle. That's a place that you wouldn't really put a mark like that. So what I've been interested in recently is creating bad paintings and trying to make them interesting and work. And it's kind of an interesting challenge in a way. And these sort of paintings, I've been trying to deal with that. And here's a sort of pink landscape. But again, these are fairly large. These are like 4 feet by 4 feet. So a lot of it, the way I paint as well, is I have, one way I try and get this sort of challenge is I have a lot of half-empty tubes of paint, and I oil the whole canvas, and I squeeze these paints directly onto the canvas, just straight out of the tube, and I move them around and I work them and try and create forms and shapes with them. And after a while, I try and pull them around and make them into something that kind of hangs together as a landscape. So that's the way a lot of these ones are done. I'm not sure if that's the last one. But yeah, here's another one. So again, it's basically using up tubes of paint and creating sort of hurdles, not trying to be too careful. I mean, these are fairly large, like these are probably done with a 6-inch brush. And they're very loose and gestural. The marks are just being dabbed on and pulled around, and I'm trying not to be too careful. It's just like letting the painting suggest things to you. I had an interesting remark from Anthony Gormley last night in a video he's just done, and he said painting is about making the space in which you can create. It's about creating an environment in which you create. And so for me, this painting was about creating an environment in which I could not be too fussy about it, not have a lot of expectations about the outcome, and feel, at least if the painting didn't turn out, I hadn't wasted a load of paint because it was all half-used tubes of paint. And that's exactly the sort of process I needed to be creative. It was the actual, yes?
Just want to ask a couple of questions. So when you were talking about this tubes of paint business, I mean, are you, because I was going to ask you about your very unusual approach to color. The color in your landscape, you've not mentioned color at all here yet. And except for now, this random tubes of paint business.
Okay.
And so I want you to say something about that. And also someone is asking, please explain a 6-inch brush.
Okay, I'm going to get a 6-inch brush. Can everyone see me or not?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to show you. I'm going to get a 6-inch brush if I've got one. Well, a 6-inch brush. This is a 4 and this is a 2. So I'm using a brush about that size. It's for just one brush. So can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just using a really big brush. Like this one, I'd be using a brush that size. And the other thing is color. I mean, I just absolutely love color, but I have a sort of familiar color palette to which I've worked traditionally. And the whole idea about using tubes of paint which are half empty is that it actually stretches your color palette, and you come up with weird colored combinations that you're not necessarily familiar with. So these color combinations, sort of, you have to work with them. You have to try and make them work in a way that if I just took them out of the tube and said, well, I think this needs a bit of blue, and I think it needs a bit of green here, and it needs a bit of black and whatever. So I think it's, if you just use colors that you're totally unfamiliar with in a way, and try and make those work, I think that can make the paintings very different. And I think if we go back and look at the color combinations in these paintings, they all sort of have a certain sort of color flavor to the whole painting, if you can call it that. They all sort of have they're different. It's not like they're all painted with the same colors and they all look consistent and the same. So one of the things I think is important is to be really interested in not staying still and static and having a lot of different ideas, because there's so much information and so much to learn in art that I think it's really important just to try totally different things all the time, not sort of to get caught in a certain way of working that you're comfortable with. And so more recently, I've been sort of doing things like this, which are very different. I'm doing these a lot of concurrently with other ways of working. And these, this one's quite a large one. It's 7 by 10 feet. And this is my neighborhood from, I'm in Kingston, Ontario, and in an area called Skeleton Park. So I'm kind of familiar with this area and these buildings and these places. And they feel like, I know these buildings quite well. And so these are sort of taken from Google Street View, which is, it's an app that allows you to basically go anywhere in the world and walk around towns and places. And when you go to Google Street View, it kind of anonymizes places. They become kind of anonymous. So I thought it would be interesting to take these anonymous places and try that I was familiar with and make them into something that I feel it's just sort of like claiming them back. It's making them something personal and part of the neighborhood again. And one of the things that Google Street View does, which I kind of like, is it has these sort of mathematical algorithms that are purely mathematical, but they have this sort of interesting way of deconstructing things when they go slightly wrong. And this one here, you know, this building has been kind of deconstructed in an almost sort of like cubist way, but it's a painting I know really well. And it's an area I know really well. And I think this is kind of fascinating, excuse me, in the sense that it creates a sort of weird mood. So it's a sort of kind of what I know and what's been done to it by Google Street View. And I like that sort of interplay of ideas there. Here's another one. Again, you know, it has a weird sort of, you have these weird shapes at the sides, just pointing in at the corners. The trees have been sort of made into these sort of almost monstrous like trees, you know, sort of shouting, screaming trees. And the buildings, you know, some of the areas are very sort of deconstructed, others are a bit more, you know, representational. And I love that sort of interplay.
Simon,
So,
this is a painting that has raised another question here on the side. Given that you moved to Canada, living here, how has Canadian art history influenced you? And if so, who specifically might have influenced you? And I'm looking at this painting, and I don't know if you're familiar with Casson's trees from the 1930s, but Casson was painting these enormously monstrous trees that were way out of scale with the landscapes. And I look at this and I see Casson in a way. But I'm interested in your comment.
Well, yeah, they certainly are monstrous trees. I think they're in scale. I mean, I guess Google does monstrous as well. Yeah. One of the things I remember was years ago in England, there was a show at the Hayward Gallery, and it was a group of 7. And I went to that show, and I was kind of interested by the landscapes a group of 7 did, because they were kind of very foreign in a way.
Sorry, very what?
They're very foreign. They were from a foreign mindset. When I looked at them, I sort of thought, what sort of mind would create, you know, landscapes like that? So, and I always sort of feel with the, you know, those artists that are like Varley. I mean, the ones that I really, really love are the sketches, and I find the sketches of a lot of them really sort of fresh and alive. And I sort of found at the time the sort of large sort of heroic paintings a little bit more difficult, in the sense that I probably have never really had the language in which to understand them. But that's an interesting remark, because I think, you know, maybe they were ahead of their time with the way they drew trees and things like that, because I certainly feel that, you know, Google's doing it now. So another thing I've said was I've always had a short attention span, and I've always tried to do something new. I've always tried to move on and try and do something. I've always tried not to be consistent in a way that I think is very important. It's about sort of trying to learn and trying to understand what art is. And one of my favorite sort of quotes is from Gandhi, he said, "I'm not interested in consistency, I'm interested in truth." And I think in a sense they are almost opposed to each other sometimes, consistency and truth. So I think, you know, if you look at the work I've shown you, it's, you know, to you it might be all over the place. It's been done over quite a long period of time. But for me, the important thing personally is to explore ideas and see what happens and where they go. And in that process, learn something about art and maybe something about myself as well. So that's basically what I have in the slideshow here. But what I can do is I can, if you want to go over and ask me questions about any of the images, or I can show you some of the images I have here in my studio. We can go from there if that's all right. I mean, I'm not sure how long that was, that talk. Was it okay?
Well, it was great, Simon. Thank you. If you stop sharing your screen right now. Oh, just hang on a second.
I can do that.
I'm getting it. Just wait a second, Simon.
Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Right. So I'm getting a little bit of a clamor for let's see some images in the studio. But I would like to say that this has been very, very interesting to understand this journey in a different way. Show us some images of what you've got going.
Okay. Well, and these are some paintings I've been working on recently. And I don't know if you can see these. I'll try and frame them in the camera. They look a little bleached
that
out.
right there, that
Yeah,
works.
it looks a little bleached out there, but anyway. So yeah, this is a sort of a landscape, again, painted very loosely. And when I'm doing these, I'm trying to get a sort of randomness in, I'm trying not to make the structure of the landscape too sort of predictable, and try to make it sort of, nature is pretty random when you look at it. And I think a lot of the time, that sort of randomness, people think they understand it when they're doing a landscape painting. But I think it's, well, if they look at the landscape painting they've painted and they look at nature, there's a lot more going on in nature. And I think when we paint, we tend to sort of just look at what's important and paint that. So that's a sort of weird sort of landscape. But to me, it looks like something's almost burning there in the background. I'm not sure, the same sort of flames and stuff.
Simon, when you go back to Newcastle, asks Rob Wood, how do you see the landscape environment differently there now, given your Canadian visual experience?
Well, yeah, well, I grew up in Cornwall, which was the southwest of England. I studied at Newcastle. And I mean, I guess Cornwall would be the landscape that I'm most drawn to because that's where I'm from. And the landscapes are very different. As I said earlier, a lot of landscape painting is about having an emotional attachment to the area. And if you look at people like Turner, or you look at people like Constable, they painted areas they were very familiar with, like, you know, the Haywain. I think Constable's father worked in the area there, and so Constable grew up with that area. And the way it's painted in a way that I see is painted out of familiarity. There's a certain sort of familiarity to that way he's painted it. And coming to Canada, it takes a long time to, I sort of think, it takes a long time to become familiar with a landscape in a personal way, because I don't know if it's a sort of genetic, psychological primate sort of thing, but the landscape you're in when you're growing up or developing, you sort of feel is your landscape. You feel that's where you're from. I mean, maybe if you look at primates and you look at the way troops of chimpanzees guard their landscape or their territory, and they know how to navigate it. They're very familiar with it. So it's, I mean, it's kind of coming to Canada. I think over the last 10 years, I've become more sort of connected to it in a way, and maybe mostly so for these sort of Google Street View things in this crazy way. I'm kind of seeing it less as sort of a tool in which to hang my paint, and more as a sort of area in which I belong. But that's a very sort of slow and gradual process.
Kim Drummond wants to convey that she thinks your work is just spectacular, especially as a colorist. But so I think on behalf of all of us, Simon, I would like to say thank you very much for sharing as you have today. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you.